Let's see, recording.
Okay.
Go right ahead, Hirsch.
Okay, so before I get started, I'm not sure if I actually introduced myself the last time, so I want to make sure I introduce myself. I'm Hirsch von Henford. I'm the Gollum Herald for the West Kingdom, and I'm also the Golden Stag Herald, which is a personal title. Um, I've been doing heraldry for many, many years. I'm not even going to try to calculate that one. Um, but I wanted to, I presented to Sarah the idea of doing this series of classes, and she jumped on it because she thinks it's a cool idea. Um, and The idea is that I'm going to try to do Heraldry 101, but I'm going to try to be more thorough than the average heraldry class. If you go to a collegium and you take a basic heraldry class, you're limited to an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever. By being able to do this through Zoom, we can spend a little more time on topics, and we can spread it out a little bit, and we can get more detail. So that's kind of the whole point of doing it this way. It also allows various people to, come in from various places. They don't have to go to an event to see it. So, okay. So the basic rules: make sure your microphone is off. Um, Sarah will be keeping an eye on chat. I'll also try to catch any questions that come up in chat, but sometimes I get so caught up in what I'm talking about I forget. Um, Please try to write questions down rather than trying to answer questions constantly throughout the lesson. It's a little easier if we try to keep them at the end. But sometimes something comes up that just is really urgent. Something just didn't make sense or whatever. Very important to me is that, and I've been teaching for years, questions are important. Okay, some people think their questions stupid or whatever. Questions are important. So if you really do need to know something or something didn't make sense the way I presented it, you got to ask the questions. Okay, so all right. So my voice is feeling a little weak tonight. I picked up a minor head cold this week, so I hope that everybody can hear me just fine. So okay, so this is part two. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we covered the basics of heraldry. We talked about fields. We talked about lines of partition, how you break up the field, and all kinds of stuff. So this is part two. This is aimed at SCA heraldry. I figured there was always a possibility that somebody who wasn't in the SCA might tag into this. So I added this little disclaimer. If you're interested and you're not part of the SCA, there's no reason for you not to be a part of the class, but there's going to be some stuff that talks about SCA heraldry specifically. Um, so while attempting to be thorough, Luigi, hey, um, one important aspect of this is that I'm going to try to be thorough, but it is not possible to present everything that there is to know about this subject. There is always more. I've got books on the shelf. I've got websites. I've got all kinds of stuff. Um, there is no way that I could possibly cover every single aspect of every single thing involved in heraldry. So I just wanted to make sure that that's covered. I do point out you're not expected to memorize all the stuff that I'm presenting. I don't have it memorized. I'm always looking things up. It's very important to note that you just can't have it memorized. Okay. So, I mean, you can memorize the stuff that you use the most because that just is the way the human mind works. As you use it, it tends to stick. But there are a lot of things that I'm always looking up, and sometimes, despite years of doing this, I have to ask some questions somewhere along the line. So, okay. So now, the goals for today's lesson. We're going to talk specifically about ordinaries and subordinaries. Now, you would think that if I'm talking about just one type of thing, that I wouldn't need to dedicate a whole lesson to it. You would be surprised at how much information I'm going to be throwing at you. There's a lot here. Ordinaries and subordinaries. Subordinaries are sometimes called peripheral ordinaries, and we'll talk about why when we get to it. So we're going to talk about what the differences are. I'm going to show you the relationship between field divisions and most of the ordinaries. Not all ordinaries have a relationship, but many of them do. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to show you about using the lines of partition with the ordinaries, mostly with the ordinaries. Most of the subordinaries don't use too many of them. And again, we'll talk about some of that. But the lines of partition are a very important aspect of some of this. And for those of you who are scribes, there's some really good illustrations that go with some of this that show you how to use the lines of partition on some of the ordinaries. It's an area that heralds and scribes all struggle with. So, and we'll talk about some things like codices and endorses, which are again another ways to modify things. And we'll take a brief look at fimbriation. We'll talk about fimbriation again in a later lesson as well. So, ordinaries. So here's a fun thing. I spent a lot of time looking at this because when I first started looking at ordinaries and looking at the standard books on heraldry, I was finding that most of the authors didn't say a whole lot about ordinaries, or in the case of Fox Davies, he says a huge amount. So I'm not going to try to quote everything that Fox Davies has to say. But anyway, I found it interesting that amongst Fox Davies' discussion, he says he can't see the difference between an ordinary and a lion. There's a reason for that. It's kind of complicated. And actually, I put some of that in the notes for the slides. So if you download the notes, you can see some of the discussion without having to go out and buy the book. But anyway, Fryer, who is one of the other authors that I use a lot because I like some of his art and I like some of his descriptions, talks about an ordinary or an honorable ordinary, which is a principal charge. It's got a bold shape. It's usually geometric. It's usually a fairly simple geometric shape, and it tends to be fairly well regulated. He then attempts to explain honorable, and again, honorable is a weird term with it when you're talking about heraldry. It talks about the precedence of the charge, and it talks about its position in the blazon itself. And we talked about blazon in the last session. That's the heraldic language that's used to describe the heraldry. So it has to do with the position in the blazon and all kinds of stuff. It gets pretty detailed. Basically, the SCA doesn't really use honorable when we talk about charges and we talk about all of that. It's an interesting concept. And really what honorable point boils down to is the top of the device or the dexter side of the device. So that's really what it comes down to. And we'll talk about a few interesting points about that later on. So I do actually, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the notes about ordinaries because I found some of the discussion of the origins of where ordinaries came from interesting, but I didn't want to try to fit all of that onto the slides because it's a huge amount of text, and Fox Davies in particular has a lot of opinions, and so I tried to trim a lot of it down. I found some of the interesting stuff though on the origins of where ordinaries came from. Is Fox Davies boils it down to a couple of different potential concepts, one of which is scarves and belts and baldricks being placed on the shield as a way to make a plain shield more interesting, military scarves and things like that. But he also, citing another older author, talks about, and then again, I'm going to try to sum this up real quick, is that a lot of the ordinaries, because they cross the center of the shield, may have been based off of pieces of wood that were placed on the shield to make the shield stronger. So you would have perhaps a piece of wood across the middle going from side to side, and that piece of wood might be painted a different color from the background. And this is all before armory became regulated and all of that. And it's kind of an interesting concept. But then Fox Davies takes it one step further and basically says, as far as he can tell, if anything, ordinaries were created as just a simple way to make your coat of arms more fancy and make it stand out a little bit. So again, there's a lot of detail, and I'm doing a poor job of trying to summarize it because it's kind of complicated. If you want to read it, you want to download the notes. The slide that starts talking about ordinaries has a lot of notes about this. So let me move on to the next one, which is where we're at now. So Fryer got a little wordy as well, but really he breaks it down to the basics are that ordinaries can be parted. And when we talk about parted, that's when we were looking at field divisions in the first class, so quarterly or per pail or whatever. They can be varied fields, bendy, checky, things like that. They can have a semi. Girati is just another term for semi. And they're always depicted upon a field. So one of the most important parts about ordinaries is ordinaries are placed directly on the field. They are not generally placed on another charge, where other charges can be placed on top of ordinaries. So you could have an ordinary that had 3 circles on it, that kind of thing. So that's kind of an important part of all that. So, okay. Now, what it really boils down to is I tried to put it into more modern English. Parted fields per bend and so on. An ordinary can be parted. They can have semes on them. They can have field treatments. They can have lines of partition. So another thing, Aowen or Amberdrake, and if you were in my first lesson, I talked about this a bit. Aowen Amberdrake wrote an article years ago about heraldry for scribes, which is actually where I had started with the idea of doing these lessons. And she makes a very important point. The most common error when drawing ordinaries is to make them too small. They should be large. They should be bold. The idea is that they're drawn larger when there's a charge on the ordinary. If there's charges around the ordinary, they tend to be a little smaller. But the idea is that they're a bold charge. They're an important part of the device. So. And the last part is ordinaries may be cooped. And what that means is by default, ordinaries go from one side of the shield to the other side of the shield, whether they're a bend going from one corner to the other corner or whatever. But they can also be cooped, so they're not actually touching the edge of the shield, so cut off. Okay. Now, there's also a term called a diminutive, and we're going to be seeing that a lot. Basically, it's a smaller version of the ordinary. You can have a fess, which is the first ordinary we're going to look at. The diminutive of this is called a bar. So it's a smaller, it's not as wide as a fess. Not all ordinaries have diminutives. Subordinaries don't, just because of the way that they're defined. So, okay, and one last thing I think before we actually start looking at ordinaries. Aowen's article gives suggested sizes for ordinaries and subordinaries in relationship to the field or the shield. When I was looking at Parker, which is one of the books that the College of Arms and the SCA uses a lot, I found some discrepancies between Aowen's descriptions and Parker's descriptions, so I tried to note those as we go. Many of the sizes will vary, and again, based on whether there's a charge on an ordinary or whether it's surrounded by charges. And finally, there's no hard and fast rule on the sizes. Okay, that's an important thing. A lot of people, when they start seeing, well, a fess needs to be a third of the field, don't worry about it. As long as it's bold, it's fine. Okay, so, okay, there are a couple of other things. Ordinaries often or usually go through the center. There are a couple of ones that don't. And again, we'll look at some of these. It's possible to raise them off the center point or lower them below the center point. To raise them, we use the term enhanced, and to lower them, we use the term abased. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I know I have at least one example that shows some bendlets enhanced. So, okay, so the first ordinary, now that we're actually getting to the meat of the lesson, is the fess. And this is just an arbitrary decision on my part to start with the fess. There's no specific reason for my doing it first other than it just made sense to me. So the fess is based off of the field division per fess, which we looked at last week or 2 weeks ago. So this would be a per fess on the left side, and on the right we have a fess. Okay. The diminutive of the fess is called the bar, and we'll also take a look and note that there's also a barulet, which is a smaller version of the bar, or the diminutive of a bar. Aowen Amberdrake suggests the height of the fess should be 1/12 to 1/5 of the height of the shield. Parker notes it should be about 1/3, which is really what the drawing that I'm using from Aowen Amberdrake's article shows, which is about a third. Okay. Now, one of the things that I really like about Fox Davies, which is one of the standard sources on Heraldry, is that for a lot of these, he shows the lines of partition, or many of the lines of partition, that are used to modify the ordinaries, or the field, which we looked at again 2 weeks ago. So you will note that we have a whole bunch of different lines of partition shown. So you'll see, for example, the first one is a fess engrailed. The next one is a fess invected. I do point out in this slide, as well as other places, that Fox Davies sometimes used invect, but the SCA uses invected. So there's that. And when we look at Raguli, one of the things I talked about earlier was honorable direction. Note that the points on the Raguli point towards Dexter. So by default, Raguli goes to the honorable position of Dexter. Okay, it's an odd, again, the term honorable is kind of an odd one, but so now, an important point about embattled, and I'm going to take a look at this one because I had to kind of deal with this, and Fleeg and I had some discussion the other day on this. Embattled, note images 102 and 114, by definition is only the top of the fess, or in the case of image 114, the bar, okay, which is the smaller version of the fess. If the embattlements are on top and bottom, the fess is usually called embattled, counter embattled, which would be image 103 in the upper right corner. So you will see embattled, counter embattled. But it's also possible, and it's weirdly, with all the different sources that I've got, they all talk about bretisse, but they don't give me any examples of it. It's kind of weird because it is something that's there. But the idea of bretisse is that if you look at embattled, counter embattled, the embattlements are offset from each other, so offset from the top to the bottom. With bretisse, the point that goes up would match the point that goes down on the bottom line. So it's kind of an interesting way of doing an embattlement. So anyway, if there are two fesses, they are both smaller and they are called bars, which would be image 113. So you will see image that says 2 bars. And then there are some examples of using the lines of partition there with 2 bars. So you'll see 2 bars embattled, 2 bars invected, 2 bars Raguli, and so on. If there are smaller bars, they're called barulettes, which are almost always shown in pairs. A pair of barulettes are called a bar gimel. Why it's gimel, I could not find. I looked all over the place to find an explanation for bar gimel. But multiples of a bar gimel are called bars gimel, not bar gimels. It's kind of the whole getting the language correct thing. And so on image 119, you will see 3 bars gimel. It's 3 sets of 2 barulettes. Okay, so there's a lot that can be done just with the fess. Okay, so that gives you a good starting point. Okay, so moving on. So the next one is the pail. So the ordinary called a pail is based off of the division per pail. The diminutive of a pail is called a pallet, can be spelled with 2 L's or 1 L. Parker calls and endorse a diminutive, but it's really a slightly different term, at least within the SCA. We use endorse specifically for codicing, and we'll take a look at codicing later in this lesson. So, Awen Aberdrake suggests the width of the pail should be 1/3 to 1/2 the width of the field. 1/2 would be really big. I would use 1/2 only if I didn't have anything on either side of it and there was something large on the center of it, say a dragon or something, a very large charge. Otherwise, 1/3 is probably pretty good. So again, we get some nice examples. And where are my images? Okay, there's my images. Okay. Notice on image 88 that the pail embattled is on both sides. When we were looking at the fess before, the embattlement was only on the top. So the basic rule for embattlement, and it's really the only one that this seems to affect, is that The embattlement is on the top if there is an obvious top line for the ordinary. Okay, and that sounds a little strange, but we will see. We'll look at salt. We'll look at a chevron, and we'll look at some others. Now those have what is called a top line, and so that top line would be the only part that was embattled, unless you went with embattled counter embattled, which is effectively what image 88 would be, was embattled counter embattled, except because it has two sides to it. And like I say, it's kind of a weird dichotomy in the way that some of this works. So the diminutive is called pallets, and I think the last image is showing you two pallets. My window here, yeah. So image 96 has got two pallets on it. Okay. The pale regularly, note that the points go to the honorable position, or up in this case, towards the chief. The pale rainy, there's an odd drawing error, I think, here. It seems that the vertical lines that were used to define the pale in the image 94 should have been erased, but they weren't. And so, because the rainy should look very much like the other ones where you've got a pale nebulae and so on, there should not be a vertical line there. It should just be going straight into the rays. Okay. So it's an odd drawing issue, but there you go. Sometimes mistakes slip into even the best authors' books. Okay. So if the pale is caudus, the term that we use is endorsed, and we'll take a look at that again in a later part of this lesson. I'm just looking. There's no example on the screen. So anyway, so this is the pale, and then we come to the cross. And I went through these in this sequence because if you combine a pale and a fess, you would get a cross. Okay. And I kind of did that with the field divisions when I was looking at field divisions in the previous lesson. Okay. So basically the cross is a tricky one. Okay. And I mention this because if you've looked at a bunch of documents that deal with heraldry, you will see the cross as an ordinary, which is what we're looking at here. You will also see all kinds of other crosses that are more decorative looking and so on. We're going to look at those again when we get to inanimate charges in a later lesson, because that's a huge category all on its own. Okay, so but typically a cross, if you just simply state in a blazon a cross, in this case argent a cross gules, it looks like what we see on the right here. Okay, it goes to the edges, it's equal armed, all of that. Okay. A cross that doesn't touch the edge of the field is called a cross coot. Now, AON suggests the width of the cross should be 1/10 to 1/4 of the height. And then basically what you're looking at is the horizontal and vertical arms should be identical in the width. Okay. So there you go. Now, again, here's where scribes should be really interested at this one. Okay. Look at the corners for these lines of partition. That's a really important thing because that's hard to draw. It's hard to get it right. My suggestion, if you're laying something out where somebody has a cross that's using embattled or any of these lines of partition, start at the corners, because otherwise you're never going to get it right. Okay? If you start at the corners and you start laying it out from there, you're using rulers and doing all the stuff that you might need to do to get them right. But the corners are the hardest part of that. Okay? Now, there is no, okay, I see something here. Let's see. I just got I got a confirmation from Crystal League. Okay. There is no diminutive of the ordinary called a cross, or if we take it from a different direction, the diminutive of the ordinary called a cross is what we call a cross as a charge, or simply a cross, whatever type of cross it happens to be. And again, in a later lesson, we'll look at a whole bunch of different types of crosses. Okay, so, but I really wanted the scribes in particular to see these images. These are actually out of Fox Davies. A lot of my images from today's lesson are from Fox Davies. He does a really nice job of putting some of these together and showing you those corners and showing you how to make that work. So, okay, the bend and the bend sinister. Since they are opposites of each other, I figured I could just throw those together. So the bend is based off of per bend, and a bend sinister is based off of per bend sinister. Pretty straightforward. They're just opposites of each other. A1 suggests it should be what? God, 1/10 to 1/3, and Parker suggests a third when it's charged or a fifth when it's plain, when there's nothing on it. Okay, so now the bend and the bend sinister, you will again note that when you get to embattled, which is in image 68, that it's only on the top because we actually have something that could be called a top line for the bend, and the same for the bend sinister. The diminutive of a bend is a bendlet. A bendlet sinister is the diminutive of a bend sinister. Okay, so if you look at some of these, you will also see in image 83 there's a baton sinister, which is basically a bendlet sinister cooped. Okay, and I have a footnote sort of that I'm going to bring up in a moment here. The last image, 84, is bendlets enhanced. So then when I talked earlier about raising them from the center point, bendlets enhanced, if you had three bendlets and you enhance them, this is what they would look like. This is this becomes an asymmetrical device unless you choose to put something in the blank space to the left, to the bottom left, okay? So, but it's kind of an interesting thing that you can do. And you could go the other direction with this. You could do three bendlets abased, which would take them the other direction towards the lower left corner. And if you went bend sinister instead, obviously it would go the other direction. So here's my footnote. A baton sinister or a bend sinister was sometimes referred to as a bar sinister by folk with little or no heraldic background, which is where the villain in the classic Saturday morning cartoon Underdog got his name, Simon Bar Sinister. I thought that was an amusing little note to throw in, but that's really where that comes from, is people that didn't understand baton sinister versus bendlet sinister, and they were assuming some of these strange and interesting things that have come out of heraldry over the years is the idea that a bar sinister was used to denote bastardy, that kind of thing. There's no real evidence of that. So anyway, so there we go. So Simon Bar Sinister, there you go. Now, the ordinary called a chevron based off of a field division per chevron, pretty straightforward. So the diminutive of a chevron is a chevronel, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. And again, A.O. and Aberdrake suggest the width of the chevron should be 1/10 to 1/4, and Parker doesn't actually give a suggested size. So here's a trick. One of the things that when people are filling out the forms for submitting armory, there are some tick marks around the outside edge of the shield. And they often assume that the tick marks that are down where you see some of the lines in here for the chevron are used for chevrons. They're not. Okay, and that can actually make things difficult. They're actually meant to be used for bends and bend sinisters. So anyway, so the chevron itself, and again, we get some fun stuff with these. So again, for the scribes in particular, this is very useful. You get the examples of what these look like with the different lines of partition and the corners. And again, these get really kind of tricky. You look at Raguli and Dovetailed, for example, get really kind of tricky there over on the right. Now, the diminutive of a chevron is the chevronel, and images 140 and 141 show two chevronels in different ways. The 141 is fun because it shows three chevronels braced, so they're interlaced, which is kind of a neat little way of doing that. Okay, and let's see here. The next to the last image is a broken chevron or a chevron rompu. I found that one can often give you a bit of an optical illusion the first time you look at it. Sometimes it looks a little weird, but basically the idea of a broken chevron is the center part of it gets shoved up. Okay, so it's not part of the chevron per se, it's moved up. Little interesting, and again, I could not find any explanation for a chevron rompu. I spent a lot of time trying to find out why a certain term existed, and sometimes I could find it, and sometimes I couldn't. And I use J. The image J is from a different source. This is from a book by an author named Child. This shows three chevronels rather than two chevronels. It's just kind of another way to show the chevronels. I kind of like the three rather than the two, but that's just me. So, notice that image 138 shows you chevron quarterly. So when we talk about being able to take the ordinaries and break them into the lines of you can part the chevron or you can part the ordinaries. This is what we're talking about. The chevron quarterly here would actually be two different colors, and they would be alternating the way the lines are laid out on that. Okay, so in order for it to be done quarterly, you're kind of doing a chevron per chevron and per pale, which is kind of a really complex way of saying simply a chevron quarterly. So, but if you break it down, that's really what you're doing. Okay. So not shown in these images because for whatever reason, Fox Davies, while he talks about it, didn't actually give an example, is a chevron inverted. So you can take a chevron and turn it upside down, just like you can have a per chevron field, which is upside down from a per chevron. Okay. Now the saltier is based off of per saltier. The first image shown again is the field, and the second one is a saltier. And the saltier, again, goes to the corners by default. And it's also sometimes called the Cross of St. Andrew, okay, because it's when you're dealing with medieval history, the saints figure rather strongly into a lot of different things. So, so you will often see saltiers used in Scottish heraldry because that's St. Andrew was a Scottish saint. So ordinaries, the saltier, and again we're looking at the lines of division or the lines of partition being used here. And again, you get some really nice examples of drawing these. So once again, I would start with the corners because otherwise it's going to be really hard to get those to work right. The last item is an interesting one. Image 193, Fox Davies used a saltier parted and fretty. The FCA tends to use parted and fretted rather than parted and fretty. It's a minor difference, but there you go. Okay, the Paul and the Paul inverted. For whatever reason, Eowyn didn't draw a Paul inverted, so I didn't use that. But basically, it's literally turning the Paul upside down so that the vertical line would go to the top of the device and so on. So there's no diminutive for a Paul. The ordinary called a pile, and again, because Fox Davies didn't give me any examples, I don't have examples with the lines. The pile is an interesting one. The pile actually, there's various descriptions of these. Parker talks about the pile as an ordinary which has been supposed to represent a stake used in the construction of a military bridge. And if anybody's ever dealt with that kind of construction or dealt with dockworks or whatever, we talk about the piles or the pilings. This is meant to be a representation of the stakes used for that. Don't ask me why it came into heraldry, but there you go. Now, the one trick with these is that a pile normally does not come down to the bottom or the top in the case of a pile inverted. Doesn't go down to the bottom of the shield. It doesn't touch the edge. So you've always got a little bit of the field showing at the bottom, or in the case of the other one, on the top. Now, the other thing is that you've got two different ways of drawing the pile, one of which goes from the corners, the top left and the top right. The other one actually comes in from the sides. And this is actually more accurate from what I can tell. The ones that Eowyn used for her article, which again is where I got a lot of the images that have color, are the ones that are mostly from Eowyn's, tend to be a little wider. But again, there's a lot of artistic license for a lot of this. So Eowyn suggests that the height of the pile, and really I'm pretty sure she meant the width rather than the height, should be 1/3 to one half of the width of the shield. Parker suggests about 1/3, which is actually very close to what you see in the center. Okay. Now, here are some examples again with the lines. These are all Fox Davies, and again, note that Fox Davies brings them in from the edge so that they're not coming out of the upper corners. unless you come over to the last item, which is 3 piles, 2 in chief and 1 in base. Okay, that's kind of a fun little bit. You can do some fun things with these, right? Now, there does not appear to be a diminutive term for a small pile or a pile inverted. It can issue from other points on the shield. Okay, so 2 or more piles that are typically enarched, meaning that they have an arch to them, issuing from the side are sometimes called wolf's teeth. This is the example that I'm using is from Benjamin Nafanovich Medvedkovetev, and I didn't screw that up except a little bit. But it's sable, 3 wolf's teeth, issuant from Dexter. Okay, so that's a nice little example of using wolf's teeth. I do have some information that talks about in period, there are actually examples, probably more in continental heraldry, of actual wolf's teeth being used. So, rather than using piles, that's kind of a fun little bit. And the last item is 3 piles coming to a point, either touching or nearly touching, are called 3 piles in point. Okay, so again, there's some really interesting and fun things you can do with these charges just by themselves, okay, without putting anything else on them or whatever. There's a lot of fun little things that you can do here. Okay, now, we've talked about the ordinaries. We're now going to talk about the subordinaries. Now, the subordinaries are fun because they are often called peripheral ordinaries because most of them are related to the outer edge of the shield or whatever shape that you're using. If you use a round shield, they would be round. If you use a banner that's rectangular, they would be rectangular, that kind of thing. So the subordinaries are often called the peripheral ordinaries. Okay, they're not based on field divisions. Most of them follow the shape that the armory is displayed on, and I do say most because, like a lot of the rules in heraldry, there are almost always exceptions. Okay, so now the first one we're going to look at is called a base, and interestingly, and again, I find it fascinating sometimes what one author will decide is important or worth talking about versus another author. Fox Davies doesn't talk about the base at all, which is very strange. There are different types of bases. So you have the standard base, which is way down here. Okay, you have a base that is called a pointed, which is the second image, which comes and it literally has that curve to it. It comes up to the point. A base may be an arched, which is the third image. That it can be called a mount in that case. And if you call a mount proper, it's green because it's supposed to be covered in grass. Okay. And a base that looks like rocks is called a mountain. Okay. A base that is wavy, argent, and azure. Unfortunately, I couldn't color this one in because of the way that my software works. I don't have really good software for coloring some of these things. This is called a ford if it's wavy, argent, and azure. Now, argent and azure is fun because if the primary field is argent, then the top line of this base would have to be azure. So you would have the contrast. So you'd have remember the rule of tincture from the first lesson. You would have to have the contrast against the field. If the main field was a different tincture, if it was sable, for example, then the top line of the ford would be argent instead of azure. Okay, so that you keep your rule of tincture involved here. Okay, so now Fox Davies doesn't discuss this, which is why I don't have any examples from him. But Bruce Struckenarius does, and I will be using various things from Bruce in various points because he's an SCA heraldic scholar who's put a lot of work into all of this. So. Eowyn suggests that the height of the base should be 1/4 to 1/3 of the height of the shield. And again, Parker doesn't really talk about it much either. Okay, borders. We've all probably seen shields with borders on them, or borders or borders. They follow the outline of the display of the armory. So this is what I'm talking about when I talk about the following the edge of the shield. If You had registered arms in the days when we were suggesting very strongly that female SCAers used what is called a lozenge shape, which is a diamond, to display their arms. Then the border would follow the shape of the diamond. If you are using, again, a heraldic banner that is rectangular, then the border would follow the rectangle of the banner, not a standard shield shape. If you're using a round shield, then it would be circular. It would follow the outside edge of your shield. And we'll take a look at that as well as the oral as well. Okay. And again, Eowyn gives different suggested widths from what Parker does. So now, when we're looking at these, again, the corners are important. So again, for the scribes in particular, but for everybody, knowing how to draw those is very useful. And again, I would start at the corners to get those laid out. Look at the border potency, for example, or the border dovetailed. Trying to get that, if you didn't start at the corners, would be really hard. We talked about being able to divide the ordinaries by the different field divisions. So you'll see here, image 219 is a border divided per pale. So the border itself would be two different tinctures. You can do a border quarterly. You can do a border gyrony, which is kind of an interesting idea. A border tierced in pale, or God, I'm doing really good here. But anyway, but you can do a tierced. You can do a border company, which is kind of almost checky, but not quite. You can do counter company, which is be two rows. And then you can do a full checky if you wanted to. You could also do bendy, which, and all of those different things. And that would only affect the border rather than the whole device. So a lot of fun little things here. So I'm trying to give you a lot of examples to give you ideas, things to look at, things to think about. Okay. Now, so I just mentioned, the lines are very important and getting those corners correct. So, okay. Now the oral and the treasure. The oral is a smaller version of the border. It is the diminutive of a border, but notice that the oral does not go out to the edge. However, the oral would follow the shape of the display. Okay, so if you again went to a rectangular device, the oral would also be rectangular. Okay, so that's kind of an important point to make. Okay, and then there's what is called a treasure, and a treasure is usually shown with two of them, although you can have a triple treasure. It's kind of rare. A treasure is a diminutive of the oral, and again, they're typically shown with two of them, or again, possibly three. There's one variation that we don't use in the SCA with the double treasure, and that's one that has a line of flory, counter flory, which literally has fleur-de-lis part of coming out of the double treasure on the inside and the outside. And that's because in Scottish heraldry that represents royalty, and we don't use that within the SCA. So in theory, these can use the different lines of partition, but look at these and look at their shapes, and then tell me that a line of partition would be a good idea for a lot of these. You would really kind of muddy up the device pretty badly. There would be less identifiability, which is an important part of heraldry. So while you can do it, sometimes should you, that's up to you, but honestly, I would say in this case, no. Okay, so now, Fox Davies talks about the canton and the quarter. You very seldom see a quarter, which if you look at a quarterly field, it's 1/4 of the device. You sometimes will see a canton. A canton is used also for the display of an augmentation of arms. So within the SCA, a canton cannot have a charge on it unless it is used for an augmentation. Boy, that came out weird. In other words, if you put a plain canton on a device, you can use it, okay? But if you put something on it, then it looks like an augmentation of arms, and it gets to be a problem. So now, the size of a canton ranges from 1/9 the width of the field to the 1/4, and so on. Parker notes that if it's uncharged, it should be about 1/3 the width of a chief. And the last thing is a canton defaults to the dexter side, so on the left side when you're facing the shield, but you can also have one on the right side or the canton sinister. Okay. Now the chief, you see a lot of devices with chiefs. It gets used an awful lot. And when I say awful lot, it doesn't. That's not saying anything bad about it. It's just used a lot. So you will see that I also gave you an example of a chief triangular. Okay. One problem with a chief triangular is that the field division per chevron looks a bit like it, or per chevron inverted, really. So you have to be careful with that. So now, one other thing to note, and this is an important aspect of using a chief. If you put something underneath it on the field, then since the chief must be on the field itself, then anything that's below it just simply gets dropped down. Okay, so in this particular example, which is an SCA coat of arms, note where the center of the cross is. It should be higher up, except for the chief. Because we put a chief up here, then everything below the chief gets lowered, and so the center of the cross is lower than it normally would be. Okay, so this is very common. If you used a bend sinister, even a chevron, everything would get lowered because of the chief. Okay, and you can place charges on top of the chief and so on. So now Eowyn suggests the chief should be 1/5 to 1/3 the height. Parker suggests about 1/3, and 1/3 is actually very close to what the first image shows. The one on the right is actually closer to 1/5, I would guess, just at a quick glance. Okay. Now, again, the lines of partition, just because of the way these work, there's only one line that gets modified for a line of partition, which is the bottom line of the chief itself. So these are a little easier to work with as far as all that. I like the fact that Fox Davies sometimes use things like a chief indented, but then he also shows you a chief density, so you get the difference between those. Indented and density look a lot alike. So let's see, 195 and 196 may be named backwards. So engrailed and invected, I think those are actually backwards. A chief engrailed should look, well, no, maybe, well, it depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at it as the field is engrailed, then this would be correct because you get the engrailing this way, the top of a cup. And this way it would be invected. I mentioned in the first lesson, invected, the heralds sometimes use infected to give you the idea of the puffiness. But I think they're actually backwards because the chief itself is what is being engrailed or invected. And so these are actually kind of backwards. It's one of those weird little things I think slipped past Fox Davies' editor somewhere along the line. So, and this goes to show you that everybody makes mistakes, right? Okay, there is no diminutive of a chief. That's kind of an important thing. And let's see. So those are the chiefs and all the different, well, it's not all the different potential lines, but it gives you a good feel for the types of lines that you can use. A chief can also be arched towards the top of the shield, in which case it would be a chief enarched. And you can also have a chief doubly arched, okay, which is the last image on the right here. Kind of gives you almost a heart shape there, which is kind of fun. Okay. Now, flaunches. Flaunches are an interesting one. Fox Davies notes that they are subject to the lines of partition, but it's really rare. And if you think about it again, if you were to try to put a Rainy line on these, it would make your device look really odd. It would be very hard to distinguish what you were doing. Okay. There's no diminutive of a flaunch, and typically when you use flaunches, there's always two of them. Okay, you don't use one flaunch. Okay. Typically, flaunches themselves don't get charged, which means you don't place something on top of the charge, but you can place something inside between the two flaunches. So now, Eowyn's article mentions height, but again, I think this was a typo. It should have been width. And Parker doesn't talk about them at all. So now the gore is just what it sounds like if you were a seamstress or a seamster. If you do sewing, you're used to the idea of gores or gussets. These are meant to represent a gore or a gusset. They're lined up on the edge of the shield. These do not change shape if you change the shape of the shield. They follow the line. Oh, well, if you were drawing a banner that or using a banner that was rectangular, this would have a straight edge down the left side, but the inside of the gore would be exactly what you're seeing in here. Okay. Um, you have a gore dexter, a gore sinister. The default, if you say a gore, is a gore dexter, which is the one on the left. It is possible to place charges on a gore, but you have to be careful about it. Doing so is considered within the SCA College of Arms as a step from core practice. We used to call it a step from period practice, but the college changed it to core practice, which means it wasn't done in period. Okay, so gores were not usually used in period. And there's a discussion about gores from, let's see, is it Fryer? Yeah, Fryer talks about these as stains of honor. So, and again, it's such a weird thing to call them that because heraldry wasn't about that as much, but there are all these weird rumors and things that never got documented. The stains of honor are kind of a weird one. They kind of fall in the category of there's not much evidence of stains of honor really being used much. So, okay. So now subordinaries, miscellaneous. So basically, actually getting close to the end of the lesson, which is kind of unnerving, but actually that's about right. Um, Fox Davies lists some items as subordinaries that the SCA doesn't really consider to be. And so I'm going to talk about some of them, but some of them we'll talk about in later lessons. Okay. So the first one is the gyron. This is a single part of a gyrony field. Fox Davies notes it's seldom found in armory, and I'm not quite sure it's mentioned at all in some aspects. These appear to be usable in the SCA, and despite the top bullet up here, these are actually listed in the College of Arms glossary as peripheral charges. A gyron issues from a point on the field. It's going to be one gyron out of typically 8. So a default gyrony is dividing the field into 8 parts. It would be one of those, and typically it would be the one issuing from the top left of the device. Okay, so you have the inescutcheon or escutcheon, which is a shield shape appearing as a charge on a coat of arms. They can be plain field only unless you are using an augmentation of arms. Now, I have an augmentation of arms where I decided to use an escutcheon. I know Luigi does as well. But that means that we could put something on the escutcheon, which normally you can't, because that falls into the category of marshalling arms, and that's a whole other thing, which we'll talk about in the last lesson. So but you can have a plain escutcheon on a shield. You can have an escutcheon that has all of the different things that you can do with a collet from the first lesson, dividing it in parts, putting different colors on it, doing all of that good stuff. The lozenge, fusel, massel, I think I misspelled massel, and rester are all related as they're based on the lozenge or the diamond shape. Now, for whatever reason, Fox Davies puts these under subordinaries, and he does actually talk about them a bit. I'm not going to try to get into all the details of what he has to say about it. But basically, to sum it up, he says, why these, which are simply varying forms of one charge, should ever have been included amongst the list of ordinaries is difficult to understand, as they do not seem to be ordinaries any more than, say, the mullet or the crescent. And he's right. I mean, really, they're just geometric charges. And so it's kind of odd that some books call these ordinaries. But you have a lozenge, which is a diamond shape. The fusel is a bit taller and less wide than a lozenge. And honestly, I don't know why there's a specific term for that, because it's really just artistic license. It's the way you decided to draw your lozenge. But anyway, the massel is a lozenge voided, which means the center of the lozenge has been cut out, and so you're seeing the field in the center of the massel. And the last one, the rester, is a lozenge pierced in the center with a circular hole. And again, you're going to see the field color and through the lozenge here. So if somebody were to cut a hole out of the lozenge, you would be seeing the field color there. Okay. Yeah, there are a few more that basically they don't show up under the SCA listings as peripheral ordinaries or subordinaries. These are treated as charges. And again, Fox Davies mentions them within the subordinaries, so I wanted to cover them real quickly. Excuse me. That went down wrong. You have the threat of a fret, which is by default throughout. It goes to the corners of the device as shown in image 238. Fox Davies defines this as a bendlet dexter and a bendlet sinister interlaced in the center by a massel. So, and if you think about what we just saw in the previous slide, the massel is the lozenge shape there that's voided. So you can have a fret that is not throughout, which will be called cooped. Then you can have multiple frets on a device, and so on. So now, the roundel and the annulet we'll talk about when we get to geometric charges in lesson 5. But really, to sum up, a roundel is literally a circle. It's normally solidly a single tincture, but there are also variations, and there are optional terms for each tincture of a roundel. So a gold roundel is a decent or a gold coin. And an annulet is simply a ring. The label, which I've given you a couple of examples over here, typically is used for cadency. And we don't really deal with cadency all that much within the SCA. Cadency is a whole other study of things that you can do with Armory, and they deal with first sun, second sun, third sun, all the way through seventh and eighth in some cases. So we really don't deal with that a whole lot. But the label is fairly common. Stephen of Bellatrix uses his father's arms, Paul of Bellatrix, with a label that shows him as the first son. So it is possible to do. A label typically goes to the edge of the coat of arms, but it is possible to have a label that is cooped so it doesn't go to the edge. There are two different ways of drawing that are shown here. One of them has what is effectively the dovetailed bottom to it, and the other one is just straight line. There are no specific terms for either one of them. So that's kind of fun, because if you really prefer one form of label, that's a little tricky. There's no specific term for that form. So the billet is a rectangle, and it's also going to show up under geometric charges in lesson 5. And the chaplet is kind of a wreath, and we'll talk about that when we talk about wreaths in lesson 4. So that's 2 lessons down the road. So anyway, so these are all subordinaries that are listed by Fox Davies, but a lot of sources don't call them subordinaries. I really wanted to talk about them just briefly. Just again, I'm trying to be thorough. I'm trying to give you a lot of information here. And again, don't worry about trying to memorize all this. So now, codicing is a way of altering the appearance of a lot of the ordinaries. This is kind of a cool way to do it, and I actually really like the looks of some of these. Basically, you're adding a line on the outside edge of the ordinary, but it's not touching it. So what that means is you're showing some of the feel between the ordinary and the codice. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. Originally diminutives of the bend, so they started out with bends. They're depicted one on either side and parallel to the ordinary. Okay, when you're talking about a pale, rather than calling it codiced, you would call it endorsed, because there's always something that breaks the rules. You can also be doubly codiced and so on. And you can have the codicing a different color from the actual charge that you were using. So these examples are from the book by Child, which I really like. So you get a bend codiced and a bend. Wow, I called that a bend. Wow, I'm doing really good here. Those are fesses. A fess codiced and a fess double codiced. Okay, so double codiced means there's 2 codices here, one on either side, and they're double on both sides. Okay. A pale endorsed, a bend double codiced right here, a chevron codice, which is image K over here, which I really kind of like the way the chevron looks with the codicing. Now, fimbriation is a different form of this kind of thing. You're outlining the chart. Now, the reason that fimbriation started to be used was because sometimes somebody wanted to do something that would break the rule of tincture. I'm going to give you an example in just a moment. Because remember, the rule of tincture says no metal on metal, no color on color. Well, you can get away with it with fimbriation by outlining the chart. In the early days, this was used a lot. One example, which I'll show you in a later lesson, is Andrew Abriga, who some of you may have met. He has a wyvern that is blue on a black field, and it's outlined in white. Okay, and that's how he got away with it. These days, you can't do that. Okay. The current rulings by the College of Arms are that you can only do fimbriation on simple geometric charges, which includes the ordinaries and the subordinaries. So an example here is an SCA arms from somebody who is no longer active, but it's a really good simple example. Is argent a bend or? So you can't normally have a bend or on an argent field. Fimbriated and a Borger gules. By using gules last here, it means both the Borger and the fimbriation are gules. Okay, so that's kind of a nice little trick because it allows you to put the gold bend on the white field. Okay. Now the fimbriation can use the lines of partition. It can get a little weird, and I don't have any examples of that. So, okay. So there we are. That's my class on ordinaries and subordinaries. So anybody have questions? I'm hoping there are some questions. Anybody? Nobody?
Is this when we get to say Bueller?
Yeah.
Bueller?
Everybody still awake?
Okay.
Oh, there's something. Okay, let's see what we got here.
The Sun Wolf said she's awake.
Oh, okay. There we are. Okay, well, there is a lot of information. I'm just, I have no problems with that, and I know that I'm throwing a lot at you in individual lessons. It's a lot to take in, and again, I don't have all this memorized. I have a lot of it simply through use. Okay, the more you work with this stuff, the more that, especially if you're a herald, if you start doing consulting with other people, the terms that you use a lot stick in your head, just like anything else that you do in life, right? So that's why I know all of this as much as I do know. And I had to do a lot of research just for these lessons. I was surprised at how much I had to go look up because I thought I knew a lot. And then I found out, well, okay, there's a bunch of stuff I don't know. When a person wants two charges, can they cross a division? Yes, they can. We're going to get into counter changing and that kind of thing. But yeah, you can have charges that cross a line of division. That's easy. That's a very common thing to do. The last lesson we'll get into putting everything in all these lessons together. So there's a lot to look at. And again, that one will be tricky because even when I talk about the stuff I'm talking about there's probably going to be questions. So because there's just so much. Fess embattled, counter embattled. The jack-o'-lantern teeth. So you're talking about the embattlements matching on either side. That is called bretisse, which is the term that I used earlier on that I don't have any examples of because nobody drew up any examples. But basically, the embattlements, which would be effectively the teeth, would line up. Okay, then the indentations would also line up. So that makes sense? Drawn as a zipper. So you actually have them facing each other? You would have to have two different charges facing each other to do that. Well, anyway, I have to look at it to see. So, and at least off the top of my head, that's how I would. So, okay, anything else? Like I said, there's a lot there, and I certainly, that's why I'm making all the notes available, which have all the images that are on the slides are all going to be up there, plus all the notes that I didn't get into at the bottom. Okay, well, I would need somebody to draw that up if that's not correct. So basically, the point is the roll of arms. Okay, now are you talking about the roll of arms that Kevron keeps or the roll of arms on the Who's Who? Because I tried to get the Who's Who to be correct. I put a lot of effort into that. So Kevron didn't always get everything correct, and I'm not trying to make anybody look bad, but there are things that didn't quite make it. Well, yeah, and I can certainly understand not keeping up with the notes. Like you say, there's a lot there, and yeah, so that's why I wanted to make the notes themselves available. And basically, there will be a PowerPoint. If you have PowerPoint, you can just look at it the way I'm displaying it here. But there's also a PDF, which will have all the notes printed out and so on as part of it. So.
And remember too, we recorded, and
Yes.
I'll post the recording in the event for tonight. That way you can go back and, and listen to all the other bits and pieces he added in.
Yeah. So and anybody who obviously who isn't here who wanted to be here, the video will be available as well, which is great. Where they're being hosted on the Kingdom webpage, the Kingdom YouTube server, and so on, which is marvelous because it all puts them all in the same place. And there will be links available. I'll put the links up for where to find the notes on the event after we're done. So. And you can also there will also be links up there for the previous lesson if you missed the previous lesson. So I hope that like I say, I know that there's a huge amount there. I hope that you got a lot out of it. And again, don't expect to memorize this stuff. There's just too much. I was asking a question today before this class, earlier this afternoon before this class, because I couldn't remember how to do something. That happens all the time because as you're looking at the notes and you're looking at your stuff and you're getting ready to do the class, you suddenly go, oh my God, I don't know how to do X, right? And so it happens all the time. There's just so much information. So the next lesson in 2 weeks, which is the Thursday before Crown, is going to be on humans and beasts. So we're going to start getting into the animate charges. And we're going to start with those, and then there will be another lesson that deals with all the other animate charges. Good. I'm glad. That's why I tried to get as many pictures as I could. So the note, in case you aren't seeing it, is as a visual learner, it's helpful to have the picture. Heraldry being as visual as it is, obviously, I mean, the whole point of Heraldry is visual. I really wanted to get as many pictures as I could. There are some I just couldn't find, and I'm not a good enough artist to draw them myself. So, oh, good. I'm glad you're enjoying these. I sometimes feel by the time I get to the end of the class like it went so fast. I just want so it feels like I covered it too quickly or something. The time just flew, So I'm really glad that it's all making sense and that it's working for you. So there's 4 more lessons planned, and I have them all laid out. Although, as I usually do, I'll probably be working on things right up until the day of the class because there's always something that comes up, right? So, okay, all good? Any questions? Any other questions? If not, I suppose we can stop recording then. Then if you have stuff you just want to chat about, we can. Thank you, God. Thank you for the Scribble group for signing in and checking it out.